Okay. Okay. Uh, Hello, everybody. On behalf of the American Association of Applied Linguistics, I would like to welcome everybody to our webinar on accent and variability of L2 speech by Dr. Kang. First, just a little bit of information about our panel presenter, Dr. Kang. Dr. Kang is currently the professor of applied linguistics at Northern Arizona University, and she's also the director of applied linguistics speech lab at the Northern Arizona University. Her research is on speech production and perception, second language oral assessment and automated scoring, L2 pronunciation and intelligibility, language attitude, world Englishes, and L2 phonology in second language acquisition. So moving along to our agenda, first we are doing a brief welcome, which is followed by our webinar instructions. Then we are doing our panel presentations for 60 minutes by Dr. Kang on accent and variability of L2 speech. And then our panel presentation will be followed by a Q&A session, which will be 20 to 30 minutes long. Good. And now about our webinar instructions. If you can't hear anything, you can take these few steps here. Have you unmuted your speaker? Have you selected the correct audio device? Check the audio setting of your Zoom account. And you can always restart your laptop, PC, phone if you have to. And if you're not speaking, please turn off your microphone. And all the attendees, you may want to turn off your video cameras as well. Okay. And of course, you can always ask Lakshmi, Yi, and Yunus for help in chat if you're running into technical issues. Our team will be happy to help you with the problems that you're facing during the webinar presentation. Okay, and our attendees are all encouraged to ask the questions during the presentation so that we can compile all the questions and ask them from Dr. Kang when the presentation is finished. You can submit your question through either the Q&A pad, or you can raise your hand and ask for microphone privilege if you would like to. And just a little bit information about our moderator and organizer. First, me, I'm the moderator of today's webinar. My name is Reza Dalman. I'm currently a PhD student in applied linguistics at Northern Arizona University. Our first organizer is Lakshmi Prasad Ojha, who is an MA student in TESOL at Minnesota State University. Our second organizer is Yi Wang, who is a PhD candidate in East Asian Studies and Second Language Acquisition and Teaching at the University of Arizona. And our third organizer is Eunice Yang Nam, who is a PhD student in Applied Linguistics and ESL at Georgia State University. And before we start our presentation today, I would like all of you to complete the survey, a post-webinar survey, which is emailed to you and will also be available on our social media. Okay, now I would like to invite Dr. Kang for her webinar presentation. Dr. Kang, you can start your presentation, please.
Okay, let me share.
Sure.
Can you see it?
Yeah, I can see that.
Can you see that as a full screen?
Yeah, it is full screen right now.
So can I start?
Yeah, you can start.
Okay, good.
You're looking forward to it.
All right, thank you for this wonderful opportunity. This way, it looks like I can reach out to other AAAL members and I can talk about my research, and it's very, very exciting. This is my first time doing this webinar, so I hope it works out. Today, I'm going to talk about accent and second language speech constructs a little bit. Then I will do some attitude-related talk along with the speaker listener variability and also listener training issues. Then I will end this talk with some accent varieties in global context and some implications. So this is my plan. Okay, so many people are interested in accent, it seems. People can tell whether someone is speaking with an accent almost immediately. Even if what people are listening to is just played backwards, 2-3 seconds. It's an ability that develops very early. And some people have argued that humans adapt in detecting an accent because historically, we need to know if someone was from our same tribe or from a different tribe. We use accent to make judgments about other people as well. So what is accent exactly? When we look at children's movies, accent can serve one of the two purposes, it seems. Either an evil genius or a funny characters. We are familiar with these movies, right? But never the main characters, especially prince or princess, they don't have an accent. In the US or all over the world, children are growing up with these expectations or stereotype that good people should not have accent. They shouldn't have any accent. So what is accent? Accent is a distinctive mode of pronunciation of a language, especially one associated with a particular nation or locality or social class. Accent is a phonological difference. So this means we all have accents. In second language speech, there are often 3 constructs discussed. These constructs are distinct, somewhat interrelated, and they are all equally important to listeners' perception. Comprehensibility refers to perception of how easy it is to understand an utterance. Accentedness is a perception of how different a speaker's accent is from target language. Intelligibility refers to how much the listener actually understands of the intended message. Although intelligibility and comprehensibility are closely related, it's not the same thing. And accent is partially independent of these constructs. Again, accent means phonological difference, right? And comprehensibility means listener's effort. And intelligibility refers to the extent to which a listener understands an utterance. And the graph on the right, which is quite well known, shows that ratings of utterances having 100% intelligibility proved by 18 listeners' transcription. But the accent ratings for these utterances all over the scale, from 1 to 9. That is, second language speech can be completely intelligible, but can be heavily accented. However, research have shown that learners don't necessarily realize this. Many learners still prefer to model native speakers from inner circle countries such as the UK or North America. The majority of learners consider speaking with a perfectly native pronunciation to be their desirable goal. And students are dissatisfied with their current pronunciation curriculum because of the misunderstanding of various models and accents made available to them. Therefore, scholars have been arguing that the pronunciation instruction should be moving toward setting up an international version of English, or helping learners to build a realistic goal for the pronunciation, or developing their own intelligible accent. However, English learners tend to be very passive and often relying on native speakers' judgments on their accent, saying that I'm the one who have the accent. It's my English that is the problem. But as we know, the actual problem is not just the speakers, but the listeners as well. That's why here I want to talk about the both speaker and listener issues, especially when we understand the accented speech in the context of a global communication. Okay, so let's start with speakers' variability. When we listen to accented second language speech, how do we rate them? How accurately can we assess a non-native speaker's speech? On what basis do we make that decision? Is it grammar or vocabulary or the pronunciation? Research has been looking at the relationship between the ratings and speech properties. Yet the rating features of speaking skills have not been clearly identified. Also, there has been the lack of consistent differences between adjacent groups of levels. There is no linear relationship in the development of linguistic features. Let's take a look at this graph, for example. This study was done in 2014 through one of my linguistic analysis studies. I analyzed 120 speech files from Cambridge English language assessment data. They are from 4 different proficiency levels, about 30 people from each level. As you can see, there's a big difference between B1, the beginner level, and C2, the advanced level, for their fluency features, but no real difference between the adjacent levels, the B2 and C1. A similar pattern was found for the grammatical complexity features, a big difference between B1 and C2, but no real difference between B2 and C1. Also, what is interesting is that when we look at some pronunciation errors, we still see some errors in the advanced speakers' speech files. This means even though they got the highest scores, there are still some noticeable errors or deviations. These deviations can make their speech accented, but not necessarily affecting their intelligibility, I would say. Overall, linguistic features do correlate with the speaking scores. In my earlier studies, by analyzing 112 TOEFL spoken responses, suprasegmental features such as fluency, pitch, or intonation explained about 50% of the variance in the TOEFL speaking scores. Also, when we look at how each of these features contribute to the outcome variables, it was found that there is a hierarchical priority in pronunciation features. Stress, pitch, and fluency seem to be more important than some tone choices or some other segmental vowels and consonant features. Also, when it comes to speaker-related variability, we can think about speakers' backgrounds or individual differences. As we know, age or proficiency or first language or length of residence can affect their second language speech. Also, learners' individual differences can affect their speech as well. In our recent study, motivation, aptitude, or anxiety were all positively associated with their global ratings of pronunciation constructs, such as comprehensibility or accentedness. Here, anxiety was a bit interesting, actually. It positively contributed to pronunciation global ratings, but when we look at pronunciation errors specifically, more anxiety leads to more errors. Let's take a look at the next slide. Here, more anxiety means more segmental errors and less fluent speech, shown by the multiple regression results. Also, more motivation means more fluencies with fewer errors. But age was negatively associated with the fluency. The older you start to learn English, the less fluent you become, which is rather predictable. Okay, so let's move on to some listener-related variability. So in second language speech ratings, how much error is attributable to listeners' attitudes or backgrounds? In the process of rating second language speech, human raters often have their own biases. We all know that. Some backgrounds, such as native speaker status, whether you're a native speaker or non-native speaker, previous teaching experience, or negative experience with the non-native speakers affected their judgments. As you can see from this figure, according to my study, up to a quarter of the variance in listeners' judgment is attributed to other score irrelevant factors, such as listeners' expectations, attitudes, their own backgrounds, or stereotypes. Some of you may know that I've done some stereotyping research. So let's first think about a very well-known concept, the linguistic stereotyping paradigm. Many of you here might be familiar with this already. It means that listeners ascribe to speakers stereotyped traits on the basis of their speech. That is, brief samples of speech varieties associated with the low prestige groups can cue negative attributions regarding individual speakers. So you form your stereotype judgments on the speaker without even seeing the person, but just listening to their speech. But the opposite is called the reverse linguistic stereotyping. This is what I've been working on with the Dr. Don Rubin. This means that listeners ascribe stereotyped characteristics to speech based on information supplied about the speaker's social identity. So social identity ascribed to speaker can evoke the linguistic expectancy, which can lead to stereotyped evaluation of language performance. So if you see an Asian woman like me, you will think that she may have an accent. So you make your judgment about my speech without listening to me. So using this paradigm, I've done some studies. So in one of my studies, US college listeners heard two different samples of an astronomy lecture. Both lectures were delivered by the same speaker who had a standard American accent. They heard one sample while a Caucasian face was projected on a screen, and the other while looking at an Asian face. By the way, I used the actual human pictures, not the cartoon ones on the slides here. Anyway, the listeners found the speech samples with an Asian face more accented, despite the fact that it was delivered by the same American speaker, right? And because they convinced themselves that they were listening to someone else who had a second language accent, the students' comprehension scores are significantly lower than those from the Caucasian face. And a similar study was done with ESL students. I mean, the stereotyping issue could be everywhere. So 71 ESL students heard two speech samples about an ESL grammar lesson this time, produced by an advanced non-native speaker. Sorry, my voice is a bit froggy. Students were led to believe that there were two speakers, a Caucasian teacher and an Eastern Asian teacher. Their grammar test scores were significantly lower when they saw the Asian face on the screen. They even stated that non-native teacher's lesson was a bit difficult to understand, even though, once again, the lecture was delivered by the same speaker. Accent can also determine the credibility of information. One interesting study done in 2010 showed that if certain trivia statements are read by a native speaker with no accent, listeners find it easier and also either true or close to truth, or at least they will say, I don't know. But if these statements are read by a non-native speaker with an accent, listeners will find that it's false. For example, let's look at these sentences. There are approximately 20,000 feathers on the eagle. You know, how do we know, right? A mosquito has 2 teeth. But if this statement was read by a non-native speaker, they actually find that false. My colleague and I did a similar study, but this time we looked at the relationship between the accent and grammaticality. So can accented speech make English sentence less grammatical than non-native non-accented speech? So let's listen for an example. Let me see whether that's going to play.
I think that it is reluctant that Jean will dance.
Or, There's another sentence.
He studied biology and learned how to categorize and draw animals accurately.
Okay, so when you listeners hear a sentence with a non-native accent, they actually find it ungrammatical, even though sentence is grammatical. In contrast, when listeners hear a sentence with a native accent, they find it grammatical, even though it is ungrammatical, you see? So it's the same pattern. Given these findings, how can we overcome listeners' bias or stereotyping? I mean, we need to find a solution, and that's my interest as well. So some possible approaches have been done through intergroup contact intervention. So using Albert's contact hypothesis, I've done 3 studies. First, in a very short 1-hour intergroup contact activity where undergrad students interacted informally with ITAs, International Teaching Assistants, while sharing pizzas or drinks. Next, with institutional support, U.S. undergrad students participated in a language partner program once a week throughout the semester. Thirdly, students enrolled in Anthropology 103, they participated in culture exchange programs with international students 3 times a semester. So after these contact activities, we saw some positive changes in their attitudes toward international teaching assistance speech. That is, even after these 3 interventions, undergrad students evaluated this ITA's speech as more comprehensible and instructionally more competent. So overall, we've seen here, successful communication is a 2-way street. We know that. Therefore, the responsibility for the effective communication between non-native speakers and the native speakers lies not only with the former as a speaker, but also with the latter with active, responsive, unprejudiced listeners as a native speakers. So this is actually the argument that I really want to make throughout the conversation. And let me share another listener test training study done in the more assessment context. In this study, we wanted to look at to what extent do a brief session of radar training neutralize the impact of raters' individual differences on speaking scores, especially with the TOEFL testing. And raters' background factors included teaching experience, native speaker status, linguistic training, non-native speakers, weekly contact, and the stereotyping. I used 112 speech files from ETS TOEFL test takers, and 82 naive listeners participated as raters. And these 82 raters first listened to those 112 sound files and rated them for the speaking proficiency and comprehensibility. Then we selected the 20 most severe and 20 most linear raters and had them go through some ETS training sessions, which lasted about 6 to 8 hours. Then those 40 raters, they had to re-rate the sound files. And as can be seen from this table, their rating changed significantly after the training. In fact, the proportion of variance accounted for by these background factors was first 53% before training. I mean, of course, I chose those extreme raters, right? But after the training, this variance dropped down to 12%. Drastic change. The importance of the rater variable was reduced by about 41%. So previously severe, previously lenient raters moved toward the more moderate stance. Lastly, let's take these listeners and speaker issues into more global context, the context of world Englishes. We know the role of English as an international language introduced different perspectives to the field of applied linguistics, right? So we keep hearing about the terms ecological validity or the use of the authentic material. So let's think about that. I'd like to share one recent study funded by the Educational Testing Service. In this study, we try to find out to what extent different varieties of English have an impact on listeners' comprehension scores. In this case, once again, the TOEFL test. 18 speakers were chosen from 6 different countries, representing the Cartreau's concentric circles, inner circles and outer circles and expanding circles, right? So the US and England, India and South Africa, and Mexico and China. These speakers show the range of intelligibility as determined by the trained raters. And we selected these speakers very carefully. All current professors teaching at the university level, has the right voice, and everything was very carefully designed. And we used 60 listeners from same 6 countries as the speakers. The listeners were senior undergrad students or early grad students. They all, then especially non-native listeners had received 100 or better on their TOEFL exam, so highly proficient listeners. We control the listeners' proficiency on purpose in the study. Also, listeners' passage was controlled for their factors: style, length, speech rate, vocabulary range, and their item difficulty. The results showed that using the linear mixed effect model, there was some shared L1 effects. Somehow, Indian listeners performed significantly better on their lecture delivered by the Indian speakers. And also, South African listeners performed better with their South African accent. But the other groups did not show the shared L1 effect. But what's really interesting and important is that when speakers were highly intelligible, there was no significant difference across the speakers in listeners' comprehension scores. That is, as long as speakers are highly intelligible, listeners didn't get affected by the accent in their listening comprehension test. And this is very promising, I think, in this context of world Englishes. And we did a follow-up study on this. Remember I said we used highly proficient listeners in the previous study? So we wanted to find out if there is a listener proficiency effect on their listening comprehension in different varieties of accent. We used 90 Korean listeners of English from different proficiency levels. They did not share their first language with the speakers, of course. The results show that advanced level and beginner level listeners did not show much difference in their comprehension score. I mean, they all performed well, or they all performed badly. But the intermediate proficiency listeners were especially sensitive to this accented speech. So we still have to explore a little more. I mean, there's something about this intermediate level listeners. And of course, this study is very, very exploratory, and we really want to have more research done in this topic. The last study, this is the last study I want to share, is about an intervention study by incorporating different varieties of world Englishes into their actual EFL classrooms. What can we do? Like, what's going to happen? This study was a classic intervention study, one control group and one intervention experimental group. It was conducted in a university in Beijing, China. 59 students in a control group, they didn't receive any intervention, whereas 51 students in an experimental group were all exposed to different varieties of accented speech. Both groups took the pre-listening test first, and they received 8 weeks of intervention, and they took the post-listening test. The test was similar to the one I introduced earlier in the ETS study. But in this case, we only used those 6 highly intelligible speakers for the listening comprehension test. The intervention for the experimental group included, as you can see, focused instruction on world English's intelligibility and different varieties of accent. On the other hand, the control group just received their traditional English test preparation curriculum, and they only used American accent because the Chinese, they prefer this American accent the most. And again, the structure of the study was rather classic. We had a pre-test, 8 weeks of lesson, and the post-test. The results show that the Chinese students from both groups improved in their listening comprehension test score, especially when they listened to those entire 6 speakers. So this is a good sign. I mean, there is a the effect for their instruction. 8 weeks of study, their listening comprehension score improved. However, when we look at their comprehension score only with those 4 non-inner circle speakers, there was an interaction effect. That is, only the experimental group improved before and after the intervention. What does this mean? The studies show that the more exposure, the better, right? Students become more familiar. This is also an important finding given that lots of EFL teachers are not comfortable with these non-native speaker models. And this finding provides some good evidence to support the high variability phonetic training, especially we talk about the ecological validity or the language fairness in the assessment context, right? In this idea, we can think about the cycle. So teachers and learners, they have to receive some kind of explicit educations. Then we can introduce this high variability training, and later learners will improve their listening comprehensions, and we can continue this cycle, especially in the context of world Englishes. What I'm really trying to say is teachers and learners, they have to be taught about this importance explicitly. Maybe teachers can spend extra time by talking about it. Learners can discuss something about this issue, but there has to be some explicit discussion on this. Okay, so I talked about accent and variability of second language speech. I've gone through a lot of studies and a lot of different topics. I started with accent by saying we all have accents. Also, I emphasized that communication is a two-way street. And I also mentioned some speaker-related factors like motivation, aptitude, anxiety, and also I mentioned speech properties. Also, I mentioned the listener background factors, their biases, stereotyping, and some World English varieties in listening comprehension. But lastly, I talked about the training in different varieties of World Englishes, especially intervention study is very promising. If we introduce different accented speech to non-native speakers by a non-native teacher, it builds up a lot of motivations and confidence as well. And pretty much this is my main point, and I hope my talk today can inform your practice in not only your language learning, your language teaching, and also language assessment. Okay, so I think this is it. Reza, do I get back to you? Hello? Reza, I can't hear you.
Yeah. You can hear me right now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Thank you so much for having this enlightening presentation. It was really interesting to just get a lot of valuable information about accent, about training, about variability, speaker variability, and listener variability.
Maybe I introduced too many and too much.
Yeah, it was just a lot of good information. And good. With that being said, I would like to open our discussion to our audiences and proceed to Q&A session. Let me share. Okay, good. There are I can see a lot of questions that are asked by the audiences, and I will be asking these questions. Okay, one of the attendees asked this question regarding how should, for instance, test raters, for example, TOEFL, IELTS test raters, or teachers be trained to help to mitigate their bias toward non-native speakers' speech?
So, like I shared briefly about this TOEFL training study, what I'm really hoping to do is all these trainers should be exposed to different varieties of accent. Even test takers or the raters. You know, currently the ETS website, they provide some materials about what the ETS testing is about. But what we don't do is we don't provide different varieties of accents for all these people can be exposed to. ETS may say, you know, currently ETS test doesn't incorporate world Englishes. It does include inner circle varieties, but not necessarily the world English varieties. So when test takers have to prepare for the test, they may go to ETS website and download the different varieties. You know, they try to train them to those accented speech. And when they have to take the test later, they can be comfortable with it because they've been exposed to. And this high variability training, the idea is if you are exposed to one accent, that actually helps your understanding of another accent. It doesn't have to be the same accent you are trained to or trained with. So that's, I guess, what I'd like to say. And then the trainers, or the raters especially, the contact hypothesis gives you some idea that the exposure is the main thing. Sometimes they will argue that just being exposed is not enough. That's why I mentioned this contact hypothesis itself. The condition has to be right. We have to have equal power. We have to have a common interest. We have to get motivated. So with a lot of careful designs of these activities, raters perhaps being involved in some of these actual interaction activities with a lot of learners first, rather than just one native speaker extremely knowledgeable about assessment, just rating speech files. They have to have some kind of actual social, psychological experience in their life so that they better understand not just the speech itself, but actual dynamics of non-native speakers. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, it was great. Thank you so much. It was detailed and yeah, it would provide a lot of good information. And there is another question that one of the attendees asked about high variability phonetic training. She asked about just, she would like more description about the high variability phonetic training, and she would like to know to what extent high variability training will affect the listener variability.
So I only introduced this idea in a very practical aspects. High variability training is usually done in an experimental setting. In a lab, you will be exposed to one or two phonemes very extensively. So let's say you as Japanese learners of English having problem of L and R issues, and you don't really tell that differences, perceptual difference yourself. You're constantly being exposed to those two phonemes and being trained for that. And later, you'll be able to discern the differences between these two. That's pretty much like a one quick example of high variability training. Although there's another a website developed by Dr. Ron Thompson for accent coach. He has a website that being exposed to that introduces a different phonemic differences. But my idea is you as a teacher, as a learner, as a rater, you try to be exposed to a lot of different accent varieties yourself. And later you are listening to totally different sound that you never heard, but because of your training with lots of varieties, you will be able to understand things somewhat better, definitely more comfortably, definitely more confidently. So that's my argument. One of my PhD students is currently working on this listener training issues. She's also trying to measure some psycholinguistic aspects of it. So if you are being trained to that particular accent, like how quickly you are able to process it, right? And that's an unknown fact at this point. But one thing that I know through my studies so far is that you constantly being exposed to different varieties, or you as a teacher trying to introduce these varieties to your students, there is a consequence. In fact, a very important effectiveness happening after that. Also, you being aware as a teacher, as a learner, the importance of the varieties makes a difference. You will give students additional motivations, and students going to receive that encouragement. And of course, another study that I didn't introduce, done in Jennifer Jenkins in 2005, she interviewed Chinese teachers in China, asking them about, how they feel about teaching non-native variety and also being as a non-native teacher. And a lot of teachers are not comfortable about it. And because learners prefer still, like I said, native teachers, native speakers, especially the prestigious model, the inner circle model. But if you keep emphasizing the importance of this variability, learners will realize that in this world of globalization, what's really important is not the native speakers model, but actual clear speech, the intelligibility. That makes a difference. Did I answer your question too?
Yes, that was great. Thank you
Yeah.
for your detailed response to the question. Yeah, it was so enlightening. And one of the attendees asked the question regarding two-way street communication.
Yes. I'm very excited about that.
Yeah. You talked about intelligibility and two-way street communication. And the attendee asked, how can we just apply this, how can we communicate this concept to the teachers and learners in EFL context, where still native speaker is still norm in those contexts? What are some of your suggestions to the teachers in those EFL contexts, where still the teachers and learners are looking for just perfect accent, native speaker accent?
So are you asking me what we can do with our learners or the native teachers, or what we can do with the native speakers as listeners? Like, which one is your focus?
What can we do with non-native speaker teachers and non-native speaker listeners in EFL context?
To talk about this two-way street, the importance of this communication.
How can we apply this concept?
Yes. I mean, in fact, like I said, I've only done 3 studies so far, but this is the one that I am very enthusiastic about. Like, I am determined to continue this research, this line of research. What I can say is, first, we have to make this idea very explicit. Oftentimes, teachers will spend so much time teaching about the importance of pronunciation, importance of grammar or vocabulary. Of course, that's the purpose of this ESL, EFL lessons, right? So you start with a lot of good activities, good textbooks, but every time, maybe at the beginning of the semesters or once in a while, you constantly have to mention this explicitly to learners that if you have a communication problem, it's not your fault. Very likely, it might not be your fault. And because of these factors, the native speakers not willing to listen, native speakers having their own stereotyping issues, they probably just don't want to listen to your speech. That's why the communication breakdown happens. When it happens, though, don't just blame yourself. My survey did show that every time some communication problem happens, 90% of the cases, learners will complain or blame themselves. Oh, because my English is not enough. They don't understand me. Oh, I should have spoken slowly. Maybe my speech is not clear. But they should make it more objective by thinking, oh, this is not happening. Maybe communication, maybe I should be more confident. I can ask the listener, which part do you not understand? Instead of just saying, oh, do I have to repeat? That actual action skills need to be taught along with this mindset that anytime anything bad happens, it's not the learner's fault. A lot of the case is 50-50 responsibility. So, when you teach listening speaking classes or when you take listening speaking lessons as learners, we are constantly focusing on the actual linguistic components, but we are not really thinking about the social components or psychological components, non-linguistic components. But I think more in the future, we really have to emphasize some of these aspects. So that's what I like to argue.
Okay, thank you so much. Great. And another question that one of the attendees asked, it's a little bit a broad question. She asked, how do you see the development in the field of speech variability and accent? What progress have you made and what needs to be done?
Yes, yes. As we all know, 1997, 1995, the three speech constructs, thanks to Doing and Monroe's dedicated studies, we know these constructs are now independent. In the past, what do we know? Like, what did we say? You have an accent, so I don't understand you. Accent and proficiency and intelligibility, they're all the same thing. Now we don't do that, right? We don't treat that anymore. So that is a big improvement in the field. Then we've been trying to understand what kind of speech properties really correlate with these constructs. We try to see whether vocabulary matters, whether accent, intonation matters. So we've been looking at some linguistic components. We've been also looking at learner factors. What kind of individual differences will make your speech accented, right? So we've been looking at those parts. Of course, language acquisition components. You know, how we can teach our learners better, in what method. By doing that, we've been introducing different visual support technologies, especially nowadays. We've been having this, you know, mobile device, also the computer animated technologies. So I think we are moving toward, I think, more into the technology interface aspects. So how we can incorporate technology development into this speech development. But what I think is still missing is some psycholinguistics aspects. We still don't understand how people process this accented speech. I've done some research on threshold of intelligibility, but that's another question. At what point we find that speaker's speech more intelligible, although that person has an accent? Threshold of foreign accentedness. At what point I don't find that accent annoying? It's still understandable, and I find that accent totally acceptable. You know, that's one area that I think the field will be moving on further, along with that technology aspects, right? And another thing is with the connection with AAAL's theme last year, a couple of years ago, how this accent can be actually understood in a real life context. A lot of studies been done in what the university academia context or experimental context, right? But by having an accent, what does that mean in the professional field, as a doctor, as a waiter, as a high school teacher? So will be actually more interesting to see, and that could be a future movement, the relationship between this speech constructs, speech, second language speech development, and the real life context, especially how people perceive these accented speech, what could be the political issues related to this. I think that could be another big trend or the topic that people might explore in the future. That be enough?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. And there was another question that is quite relevant to your response to the previous question. One of the attendees asked, have you looked outside the context of a speech lab or classroom, for example, the workplace?
Yeah, I did. I didn't share on purpose because that study had some ILB issues. But I will share that a little bit, not telling any of the actual names of the places or anything, so that the study can be still protected. Yes, I did 2 studies. Actually, what I wanted to find out in the study was using that linguistic stereotyping issues or reverse linguistic stereotyping issues. We intentionally try to reach out to upscale, high-stake restaurants in this Flagstaff, Arizona, and try to see how these people could perceive accented speakers. So we prepared we reached out 12 restaurants, and one of my research assistant, she actually immigrated to the States when she was 5, so she's just a native speaker. Of course, you could hardly tell any accent from a speech, but she originally came from North Africa. So with the 6 restaurant managers, we first reach out to them by saying, we'd like to work at your restaurant, and this particular person, would you be interested in hiring this person as a waitress? And can you have a short job interview? So we didn't release any information about this study idea. And with the 6 restaurant managers, she came to them as a non-native speaker. So she was a fascinating person. She was able to speak with a very heavy North African accent. And the other 6 restaurants, especially those managers, when she had a job interview, she presented herself as a native speaker, just perfect accent. Then we wanted to find out whether these restaurant managers could still hire the student, And surprisingly, whether she came out as a perfect accent as a native speaker or a person with a very heavy accent, only 2 restaurants out of 12 wanted to hire her. So it was very shocking. Also very sad. I mean, I intentionally, myself as a non-native speaker, I am personally interested in this topic. And I was very sad finding out this research. So I was supposed to share this with the public, but it was a bit difficult. I now trying to go through the ILB, and I'm sharing this casually, but this is, I think, where we are. The reality is so far. And I talked about this, intervention studies. I talked about this context hypothesis. I've been trying to make an effort, but when it comes to the real life situation, it's very difficult, I think, and so much work to do. And I hope a lot of people out there who are interested in this topic can feel very responsible for this and try to do a lot of research on it. And I think this is
quite interesting. And I like your enthusiasm when you were talking about the results of your research. Yeah, it was really, really interesting.
I don't know, I became emotional. I feel sad again.
Okay, and thank you for sharing with us the results of your study, which is still unpublished. And another participant asked the question, she said that most of your recent research is centered around accent in relation to intelligibility, which is listeners' understanding, and not comprehensibility, which is the amount of effort which is expended by the listeners.
Yeah.
Is it because you think intelligibility is actually more important than comprehensibility, or is it what expected by, for example, by students from their ITAs, or?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. Whoever this person is must have studied my papers quite well. So thank you very much. Yes, it is true that I've done on intelligibility a little more than comprehensibility. I would say there are 2 reasons. First, not me, but if you are interested in second language speech, a lot of scholars, a lot of people are doing comprehensibility and accentedness related studies. I noticed, you know, Dr. Pavel Trofimovich, Dr. Kazuya Saito, Dr. Talia Isaacs. You can see a lot of these names. They have done a lot of studies on comprehensibility and accentedness. I first studied with comprehensibility and accentedness, like back in 2010, in 2011 and 12. It's actually easier to measure because oftentimes we just use the perceptual global judgment approach, a scale from 1 to 7, 1 to 9, or 1 to 5. And you ask listeners to listen to the sound files, you quickly capture their perception. And I thought it's easy to do, but later what I realized was that intelligibility is the one, this is to what extent you actually understand that speaker's utterance, right? So that's the part that people really have to find out. And that's the actual construct that determines the speaker's ability of making that person's speech clear, the clarity. So I personally got more interested in intelligibility, quite honestly. You might have read my 2018 language learning article. You know, people often say intelligibility is somewhat more complicated to measure because oftentimes people use the transcription method. Transcription takes a lot more time than just listen and just make a quick judgment, right? So I wanted to develop different ways of measuring the intelligibility. I actually am currently doing some research on the threshold of intelligibility. So my second reason is I find the intelligibility a little more important than the other two constructs at the moment. It's not like one is more important than the others in general, but personally at this point, my interest is more on intelligibility.
Good, thank you so much for your detailed response. And another question that one of the participants asked is about the software programs that you tend to use.
Yes.
That you tend
Thank
to
you
use.
so much. You guys must have studied my research quite a bit.
Yeah, there are a lot of good and interesting questions here. And yeah, what kind of software programs do you use to analyze speech features in your studies? And what kind of software program do you recommend to researchers?
So earlier studies, I used the CSL, Computerized Language Laboratory, Speech Laboratory, CSL. And that software program is not free, and it comes with hardware. So I think I bought that program by paying about $13,000. So it wasn't practical for my students. So the most program that I've been using, the most common one that I've been using is PROT. And some of you may be very familiar with the PROT actually. So PROT is free speech analysis software. You can download it in 10 seconds or so. So that's what I've been interested in and I've been using. But I don't know whether you read my 2018 language assessment quarterly article. My postdoctoral scholar and I, we developed a computer program that automatically extracts prosody features. My 2010 Modern Language Journal article, I analyzed the sound files for 29 suprasegmental features. And I actually created this computer program that automatically extracts all those features. We used a lot of different automatic speech recognizer systems, and it's a lot more complicated. So when I have a very large speech corpora, like 500 and 800 sound files. Then I use this automatic speech extractor myself, with the caution that the reliability of this program is about 80%, but it only provides us some general patterns. It's not like 100% reliable like a human coders. But as a matter of fact, human coders are not entirely reliable. When you try to analyze tone choices, oftentimes the reliability is only 78%, or I mean intercoder reliability is or 85%. You never get to reach up to 100%. So you have to retrain themselves constantly, because the tone and intonation is a very tricky component in speech properties. So I would say, with a very careful statement, I use this speech extractor for some of these data. Otherwise, I tend to rely on prot quite a bit at this point. And I noticed there are like fluency extractors available for free, and which can calculate syllable per second, in an instant second, really. And I think some people are using that, and some are reliable, but some are not. So if you want to use any of these existing programs, you have to double check the reliability between the program and yourself, and making it consistent. And consistency is the most important part, I think. You can't just use one program for some of your sound files, and then you just hand code for another sound files, and then you do something else for another sound file. You can't do that. Of course, what's really important is you have to make it consistent throughout your data if you want to use that.
Great. Just a question that I have based on your description right now. I was wondering, by consistency, you mean if you're analyzing these speech files, one group of speech files, we need to rely on only one analyzer and not just a variety of analyzers if you want to be consistent and the result will be reliable. Is that right?
Well, when I was doing my PhD, what was it, like 2007, 2008, at that time, people didn't question me whether I could do the analysis by myself or whether I could do this with someone else and check the intercoder reliability. I noticed people thought the software computer program is reliable enough. So since you are looking at the actual prod, not just yourself, you think you are looking at the fundamental frequencies, you're looking at the length, speech spectrogram. So we thought that's reliable enough. But later, those of you who have done this analysis will know and agree. When you are doing this analysis with this speech analysis program, you have to make a lot of decisions yourself, whether you have to draw the line here with that particular pause, or is it that frequency ends the second line or third line. A lot of subjective decisions are made. So nowadays, what's recommended is you still have to look at the data together with someone else, depending on the availability. Maybe the 10%, 25% of the data should be coded by someone else. Just like you are doing like an inter-rater reliability, looking at some learners' development data, trying to see how we can agree on your ratings, you probably have to do the same thing with the speech analysis. Then once you reach on that enough good reliability, then using that agreement method, you can finish up the rest of the data. I think that's what most people have been practicing. But ideally, the more people code it, the better, or the more reliable it will be. So what consistency, what I meant by consistency is, yes, using the same method throughout. Whether you do it by yourself, with someone else, that's another question. But if 2-3 people are involved, yes, you can look at intercoder reliability. Very likely though, in a real practice, speech analysis is such a labor-intensive process. So oftentimes, having two people analyzing the same data takes so much time and money. So very likely you get trained at the beginning of the stage, and then the one person finishes up the whole thing. I think that's what most people do nowadays.
Great. Thank you so much for your response. And another participant asked this. You talked about the need to maintain ecological validity and fairness in language assessment.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. How do you think we can do that?
That's a tricky question. That is actually a question that I get a lot, especially after publishing this TESOL quarterly article, I think it was last year. In that study, pretty much what I just shared today, as long as speakers are highly intelligible, listeners didn't have problems. But again, keep in mind that in that study, these listeners were highly proficient. Remember another follow-up study? Intermediate level listeners were very sensitive to accented speech. So ecological validity can be interpreted in two ways. If you are introducing an accented speech, especially given that there's an L1 shared effect, like Indian learners of English somehow performed better with the Indian speaker, right? So actually, if TOEFL, ETS TOEFL is including an Indian accent in their listening comprehension test, it's not fair because Indian listeners or Indian test takers will perform better. So in that case, the ecological validity is not fulfilled, is violated, right? But at the same time, let's think about the current world English's context. Everyone speaks English. We all know English is an international language. Everyone has an accent. Just using this inner circle accents in an assessment context is not fair. So the fairness can be argued from two different perspectives. That's the complexity we have. I think that's where we are. I think the bottom line is though, like I said, when TOEFL test takers, most TOEFL test takers, their purpose of taking the test is to come to the States and join their higher educations, right, for their graduate degree. When they come to the States, when they start to take classes, a lot of professors are not necessarily Americans, right? A lot of international, including myself, right? A lot of professors are international, who have international background with their own accent. I have an accent. Thankfully, so far, nobody complained about my accent, but the reality is they have to be aware of these varieties. And that's what the real life situation is. Therefore, whether the L1 shared effect has an issue or not, in fact, somehow, there's another study done by Dr. Sun at Indiana University. His findings show the very similar results that somehow Indian test takers performed better with Indian accent. But the rest of the L1 groups are somewhat mixed. And a lot of studies have been showing that there's no L1 effect. So by using that, I really hope that in the future, we have to incorporate these varieties in an assessment context. And we provide the training materials. Like I said, we constantly let them being exposed to different accents. And eventually they feel comfortable by taking this. And that's probably the future trend. We can't just talk about one group is going to perform better. So far, Chinese test takers don't necessarily benefit from Chinese accent, actually. But we know the number one TOEFL test, well, TOEFL is just an example. IELTS is another. But number one population of these high-stake proficiency tests is Chinese. So something that we have to think about, and we continue to make this effort. So far, I don't really have an answer, like a definite answer, but I think I can say that we need to move on to this incorporations of world Englishes in the assessment context. And that's how we can redefine the validity.
Good, thank you. And I think we have time for one or a couple of more questions, if possible.
Yeah, this is a lot of fun. I'm really happy, and I appreciate all these questions, and it could really, they could tell me now that how many of you been reading my research, and it makes me feel very, very appreciative, very happy.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for giving all detailed response to the questions. One of the participants asked that you mentioned the importance of explicit instruction and discussion of varied accent in EFL context, and the importance of teaching actual skills. Can you recommend any references that can be helpful in conversation about intelligibility that are not just inner circle centered and just include some accents from different World English varieties?
You know, there's some ESL, EFL textbooks. I mean, I don't have them. I did see some of them. There was a TED Talk, I think it was published by National Geography or something. There's some books on that. Not many ESL textbooks though. Actually, what I would recommend is if you're not in China, because I hear quite often from Chinese students and teachers that they don't have access to YouTube or TED Talk or any of those, but you can intentionally use some of these accented speech materials from those websites and introduce them. That's the most effective way at this point. And also, we didn't talk about this authentic materials. So someone brought up the ecological validity, but another topic that everyone is talking about is authenticity or authentic materials. A lot of listening assessment scholars have been talking about the importance of incorporating authentic materials. One of the important approaches for these authentic materials is using these actual the clips from this media. So you can use the video clips, the movie clips, YouTube clips. There are, and once again, the TED Talk. You can get lots of good materials from them and play them in your class. And also another fascinating and effective method is, let's say you are a non-native English teacher trying to introduce different varieties. You as a teacher, I'm sure you have a very intelligible accent. Prepare a listening sound file yourself, or you actually ask your colleague, someone else who has a very intelligible speech, but still have an accent, play these sound files or use them as a listening models in your class. And try to talk about what makes this speech so intelligible. And that's gonna give your learners extra motivation. And oftentimes learners are already familiar with your accent, so they actually understand that listening passage better. So making some additional materials rather than relying on these existing textbooks. I know there are a couple, but one thing for sure is that there are not many. A lot of ESL textbooks. I teach listening speaking methodology class. I'm constantly trying to collect more listening speaking materials. Not many materials we can see out there that have incorporated these varieties of accents yet, but maybe they will more in the future. But at the moment, you can prepare those materials yourself. It requires a lot of extra time and effort, but if you're committed to do it, I'm sure you can do it.
Excellent, so enlightening. And can I ask the last question?
Sure.
That one of the participants just asked, would you recommend integrating World English's approach in ITA training programs in the United States as well?
Oh, I haven't thought about that part. Would I incorporate world Englishes or varieties in ITA training class. I was an ITA trainer. That's why some of my early studies were on ITAs, International Teaching Assistants. I trained ITAs for about 2 years at the University of Georgia. At the time, I didn't know a lot of these findings, right? But I noticed those ITAs before me, the trainer was always native speakers of English. I was the first person at the University of Georgia as an international person who became a trainer of ITAs. I was so worried, of course. I was so nervous. I thought these ITAs would complain about me because I wasn't a native speaker. Like, how on earth I could train these PhD students? I was a PhD student too. But at the end of the semester, what was fascinating was everybody appreciated me by saying, oh, I could be like you. I could have a little accent, but I had no problem understanding your speech. I would like to speak like you. I was a good model to them, you know, and I was able to share what made my speech intelligible. I was able to share the strategies that I was using. So in fact, incorporating these varieties, of course, we have to choose the right varieties and right versions, right? But with the careful selections of this approach would be actually very effective and could motivate them. We know a good English teacher is not necessarily the native speakers of English. The good English teacher has to be the non-native speaker who can speak English, of course, very well, but who has gone through all the problems like learners, who could share the first language too, so that the teacher could exchange a lot of important strategies and other methods with learners and be sympathetic about learners' problems. So when it comes to ITA training, perhaps we can introduce different varieties. Ideally, if you have ITAs from 5 different countries, we perhaps choose those varieties, professors' accents from those 5 countries, and introduce them and try to analyze what makes this person's instruction extremely effective. Maybe a lot of the cases, not necessarily the speech that we know. Maybe the PowerPoint slides are extremely good. Maybe the gestures are extremely good. Maybe eye contact is really effective, you know? So perhaps it's going to be another way of developing a curriculum for ITA training courses. And I agree. I actually like that.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thank you so much again, Dr. Kang, for this engaging and really enlightening presentation. And we appreciate you sharing your research finding with us today. And unfortunately, we don't have enough time to cover all the questions, and all participants who have any more questions, they can ask the questions from Dr. Kang through email.
Yes, please email me. Yeah, I'd love to answer your questions.
Thank you so much for being open to all of the questions and providing a lot of good responses to them.
Thank you so much, this wonderful opportunity. And of course, you know, my research area is very limited, but if I just want to share that if you have a passion and your enthusiasms and your commitment about the research topic you're working on, I know you'll do a fantastic research, inspiring research, something that nobody has done in the past. And I love to read all of those, the findings as well.
Good. And I felt the enthusiasm in your sound when you were presenting the result of your research, and it was really, really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Reza. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening to my talk.
Good, thank you. And I would like to thank all of the attendees who participated in this webinar and our organizers who just organized this webinar and all the other opportunities. Before we finish today's webinar, I would like all of you to complete the post-webinar survey, which is emailed to you, and it is also available on our social media. Thank you again, Dr. Kang. Thank you again, our participants, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.
All right, the same to you, the same to everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, thank you.